Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second RCN Wales Leadership Session. I'm delighted that so many of you have been able to join us today, and we had a really good session with Andrea Bradley, the matron from Swansea Bay University Health Board last week, and we've got just as much an exciting session with Professor Daniel Kelly OBE, and also a fellow of the Royal College of Nursing, who has done quite a bit of research on researching the executive nurse director's role. Danny, I know you're just on speaker, but we are very excited to hear your presentation. And following that, we will then have lots and lots of questions for you. So Danny, over to you.
Thank you, Denise. Apologies, everyone. Not being able to join the call as normal, but we've had some technical difficulties. But never mind, it's great to be here, and I'm so pleased that so many of you have joined this lunchtime event. Now, I have been interested in researching the role of what we might call the more executive level people in our profession. And that's largely because they are very important people, obviously, but perhaps more importantly, we actually know not very much about how the role is actually enacted and some of the problems that they might face. So let's have a look at that in a couple of projects that I've been doing recently. So next slide, please. So the origins and where this research interest came from was for a number of reasons. First being that executive boards of health boards or trusts, there have been a number of high-profile events, such as the Francis inquiry, that laid particular attention at the door of the people on the executive boards and laid some blame at the nurse directors, as they were usually, but not always, thought to be responsible for quality and safety. And therefore the role was naturally coming under more scrutiny, and people were even asking if these roles were necessary. Now, when you balance that against, in the yellow box, the fact that nurses are the largest proportion of the workforce, obviously nursing leadership is not just an interesting concept, it's actually a very, very important one in my view. But there's actually limited evidence, as I say, about the day-to-day nature of these roles and how they communicate, how they transmit concerns upwards to the board without always being criticised as being what some people have called the bleeding hearts, i.e. bringing problems to the board rather than solutions. Now, when you look at some of the data around how long people stay in these posts, it's again an issue perhaps for some concern. In a study back in 2014, over half have been in posts less than 3 years. That may not always be the case in Wales, but this is an England and Wales figure. And then just associated with these roles, we've got some new developments in NHS England that we've been looking at Cardiff, which are the Freedom to Speak Up Guardians. These are new roles intended to address some of the concerns that came up in the Francis inquiry, so people had somewhere to go should they be worried or concerned about standards of care. And obviously there's a link between those roles and the remit of the nurse director. I might be able to say a little bit more about that project as we've just completed it. So next slide, please. Now the context, as I've said, for this work is really concerns around standards of care. There's two reports mentioned here, the Francis and the Keogh review. And these are focusing on England, around quality and safety of hospital care and the ability of nurse execs and boards more generally to provide the necessary leadership when it comes to things like patient safety, care quality, and also patient and family satisfaction. And, you know, when Francis reported back in 2013, after the Mid-Staffordshire inquiry, he made a call for more, not less, influence at board level, as he said, because nurses can provide invaluable advice and support to boards in a whole range of matters, and are well placed to resist sometimes the corporate pressures to toe the line when patient safety is at stake. So that this was put into the Francis report, calling for a stronger nursing voice at the executive level. Next slide, please. Now, we know from existing research that the boards of healthcare organisations are perhaps most influential in setting the overall direction and the commitment and priorities given to quality and safety. So that's not a new idea, but the new issue is how these boards are actually constituted. Now, nursing was represented at board level and has been since 1991 in England. I'm not sure about Wales, but I think it followed shortly thereafter. And the primary post that was established in law was that there should be a nurse executive or equivalent, I believe, these days. Now, as we've said, these people are leading the largest proportion of the workforce, and they can, if working well, bring unparalleled understanding of issues of quality within that organisation. Now, obviously, that relies on these people having an ear to the ground, having very strong networks, and having the necessary willingness to listen to what's happening on their patch. However, whilst these executives often have responsibility for many, if not most, of the quality and safety agenda, things sometimes, like infection control, patient experience, but they may not always have control over things like staffing or finance. And as we can see, the external environment, when it comes to things like vacancies, overseas recruitment, how to pay staff, the culture of the organisation, these can all combine to impact on the nature of the nurse executive role. Next slide, please. And we mustn't be complacent about these roles. This is a headline in the Nursing Times a couple of years ago now, claiming that the contribution of nurse directors are not seen as valuable, but either by others on the board or perhaps others higher up the chain. So this is a concerning sentiment, I would say, that is creeping in and calls us to find out more and ask questions about these roles. And next, please. So when we set out to design the study that I'm going to tell you a bit about, we were interested in what were the experiences of executive nurse directors at board level in England and Wales. How did they, what strategies did they use or processes did they use to try to get their views about quality and safety taken into account? And we sought to do this really by qualitative, semi-structured telephone interviews across NHS Wales and in England. Next, please. So we had 37 women. The mean length of experience in the role was 5 and just a quarter years, but that could range from 3 months up to 15 years plus. So quite a wide range of experience in these people. There were a variety of organisations, 6 health boards in Wales, which, as you know, combine a number of services together. In England, acute services specialist community, plus 1 ambulance trust. Now, out of all of those people, those 40 people, only 2 of them held the nurse staffing budget, and everything else went via a chief operating officer. I think that's an important point just to emphasise. So we spoke to these people using semi-structured interviews, analysed these data using a computer program, and fed back some early findings to the participants. We gained ethical approval, as you would need for a study like this, at Cardiff University Healthcare Sciences. And next, please. So the findings, I'm just going to go through quite quickly today. So we found that there were experiences of nurse directors who worked with what we call supportive and engaged boards. There were experiences of others working with unsupportive, avoidant boards, perhaps with a poor understanding of safety, quality, and even of the E&D role itself. We unearthed some strategies deployed by nurse directors to ensure that the nursing voice was heard at board level. And there were two prominent and interrelated strategies used. These included briefing, i.e. briefing people before meetings and building relationships around themselves, and also preparing and delivering credible cases, i.e. choosing quite carefully the battles that they would fight. Next slide, please. But of course, nothing in healthcare is static. So although we perhaps classified these boards as being supportive or unsupportive, obviously that could change, you know, with new board members coming on board, with a new chairperson. So attitudes they weren't fixed. They could certainly change over time. And ideas proposed by the nurse directors, such as allowing patient stories to be heard, but people talked about them initially being rejected and then actually being encouraged following their mention as a good idea in the Francis inquiry. So these boards are not fixed in time. They are organic and they change, which is an important point to make. And of course, the nurse director can have an influence on the nature of the board itself, depending on how they are perceived. And next, please. So for supportive engaged boards, a couple of quotes here from a participant who said, I'm quite lucky here. I've got a very good chair, very good exec and non-exec directors. They really do pay attention to nursing, and I think that's great. But what I pick up is that it's not the case everywhere, and we have to fight to get there. And secondly, we all feel able to have a conversation and discussion in public at the board about what's happening, what the issues, what does that mean for us. I work really well with my chief exec, and as a nurse I feel confident and therefore supported by that team. So that's a kind of positive message there from two participants. Next, please. However, in a different sense, we also have unsupportive or more skeptical boards. And an example here is some of the non-execs couldn't understand why we had a nurse director. What do you do? You know, kind of approach. Constantly feeling that you're being judged by people's perceptions of what nursing is, rather than what it actually is. Everybody has a fixed view of what the nurse does, and that's usually out of date. I find you're constantly having to justify nursing and nurses. And secondly, the chief exec questioned the need for a director of nursing around the board table when she took up the role, and the fact that it was in legislation that we had to have an executive director of nursing. That's the only reason that she had it. Next, please. Again, an example of an unsupportive board. This is an example about finance. What was said to me was I need to focus on finance, which I have to say I was quite horrified at, because that was said to me without even sitting talking to me about how we could sort the finances out and stay safe. One of the issues that I was running into was the chairman of my trust. I found it quite bullying, and he seemed to be saying to me he wasn't going to let me bring a report to the board that he didn't agree with, and yet he wouldn't sit down and talk through the report with me. And the message I was giving to him was strongly that I was required to bring a safety report, and my role was to advise the board of what nurse staffing levels should be. It actually took the regulator to come in and give us a non-compliance before either the Chief Operating Officer or the Chief Executive took notice. So that's quite an extreme example of the nurse having to fight their corner. Another strategy that they described was the problem of bringing quality and safety issues up to the board when the news was discomforting or not good. And as an example here, I can remember losing the A&E target. We got this thing 95% for the year, and they just had a number of breaches in the ED, and I thought, I think that's the target going for the year. I can remember going back to talk to one of our executive colleagues and said, it's been very difficult down there, and we realise we just lost the target for the year. They just looked at me, turned round, and walked away. Next, please. So the participants did have strategies that they used to help them to be heard. So here are a couple of examples. I know our problems in terms of nurse staffing and quality. And by the November paper, I'd already briefed the board in private to get them to a position where they knew what I was trying to achieve. And then when we came to the decision making, actually, they were fully enough briefed on what was happening. So that's a case of working in advance of the decision. And secondly, rather than, I'm going to bring a problem to the board and not having told anybody like a lot of organizations, you do a lot of your business just before you even get into the boardroom. That was a piece of advice given to more junior nurse execs, not to rely on the boardroom culture itself. Next, please. And then the strategies around when and how to speak up. Some interesting examples here. I don't tend to interject or talk until I've got something significant or a proper contribution. And therefore, people know I've got evidence that it's real. I'm not one for over-egging anything. And also the way that the people learn to speak was mentioned. I think my other strategies are not to be over vocal, but make sure if I am concerned about something that I raise it and say it in such a way that board members are going to take notice. Next, please. A theme called mental aerobics is quite an interesting idea, that the mental aerobics in this first quote, that they do this thinking around the issue, thinking what is the nursing implication to this problem. Secondly, making the board aware, making sure they have good information. The papers are set out very clearly in order that the board can understand. I'm very detailed in terms of my preparation, and in terms of having read everybody's papers, try to do the read across of what everything means to each other. So what are the similarities? What are the threads I need to pull together when I'm presenting either the quality of the nursing papers, which are linked to the performance report or linked to the HR report? So I think that's an important thing for me to do. So they're acting as coordinators and pulling the relevant evidence together to fit their own nursing agenda. Next, please. Now, in terms of the other interesting issue we were interested in was how they remained resilient in the face of these challenges. And these were some of the examples that we unearthed in this study. So securing information and a robust evidence base, we've talked about that. Developing a personal style, having a sense of command of the agenda. Building a group of allies and having a sense of mental agility. Being able to think round corners is an important skill. Use the language of the clinical world, patient experience, but balance that with more objective statistical or financial data. Manage your time well, set your priorities, and decide what battles are worth fighting. And then develop a sense of balance and personal recovery from the many demands of this role. Next, please. So to summarize that study, we've said that the executive nurse directors are highly important in terms of been a part of board culture and function, and they can influence how staffing, professional and safety quality concerns are processed in health boards or trusts. However, there's a real lack of research into these roles, especially in the current context of the NHS and thinking about the impact of COVID especially. We identified the importance between supportive and unsupported boards and some of the factors that may limit their status and influence. We talked about board dynamics and understanding of the agency, by that we mean the power of the nurse directors, as well as group behaviours and the dangers of things like groupthink, where everybody thinks in the same way rather than challenging each other. These are all important. And strategies have been identified that may be common across all execs on a board, but some I would say are quite unique to nursing, given its profile and current status on some boards. So that's a summary of the key points. Next, please. We have published some papers from that study, and I've sent those to Nicola, and I'm sure she can perhaps make them available should you be interested in reading more of this. Now, I just want to say briefly something about a second study called the Stronger study. It built on the first the study I've just presented. And this was looking more at how to strengthen the role across the 4 UK countries. So we involved researchers from Cardiff, King's, Belfast and Edinburgh, as well as nurse executives and CNOs and others from each of the 4 countries. We carried out telephone surveys again, and this time we asked for the nurse execs to nominate someone else who could comment on the role, not on them as people, but on the role itself. And that's that idea of, the Burns quote, to see ourselves as others see us, which is quite an interesting way to do research. We wanted to find out the priorities for the role in each different UK policy context, and thinking about things like training, support and recruiting to these roles in the future. And then, as I say, we're linking it again to the Freedom to Speak Up management study at Cardiff in terms of how concerns are managed, both formally and informally. Next, please. So as I say, the aim was to build on the Cardiff study, 4 countries, and looking at how the role can be strengthened. Next, please. We carried out the study in 3 phases. We did a scoping review, which I've provided to Nicola. Basically, it shows there's very little research on an international level for these roles. As I say, we carried out the interviews with nurse directors and with a nominated individual. And this might be a board member, might be a deputy, it could be a range of people. And then we looked at the policy priorities in each of the countries at the time of this study. So for instance, in Wales, it was strongly influenced by the Safer Staffing Bill. Next, please. So just briefly, the END, the nurse execs and the nominees had similar expectations of the role, but there were some subtle differences. The ENDs were emphasising the breadth of the role and its portfolio. The nominees also supported this, but they added that the role continues to expand and grow, and anybody who's been in these roles would probably agree with that. And they supported this growth by saying that these roles can and should have an impact on almost everything that happens in a health board or trust. And here's a quote from one of them. There's very little you can actually touch in the health board that the nurse director can't legitimately say she or he's got an interest in. And I think that view is shared by my exec team. Next, please. The complexity of the role was again mentioned when, similar to the Cardiff study, when to prioritise, when to delegate, when to take personal control, and how to manage the time. There was a general frustration at admin support as much of the time could be absorbed by doing this. However, one Scottish participant said most nurse directors are completer finishers and get it done, as we've had to be or we wouldn't survive. Next, please. Lines of power also come out as important. Relationships, networks, alliances, again, similar to what came out in the Cardiff study. And these provide lines of power, enabling the nurse director to get the work done and make their voice heard. Relationships also provided them with support, advice, and acted as a sounding board. So as one of them said, the country is run by the people who turn up. So if you want to influence and you want to shape, you need to be in the room. That's quite a good lesson, I think, for any of us interested in power and leadership and changing the world. So the final points then, I would say that these roles are very interesting for nurses because they are the kind of elites, if you like, of the nursing profession, and they provide a really sound focus for leadership and management in action. But there's been a lack of research, and there isn't a strong evidence base to underpin or strengthen these roles. There's very few insights into how they cope with the multiple demands that they face. We've seen and emphasised the importance of board cultures and how these people influence and use the scope of the role to advance the safety and quality and nursing agenda. And as I said, the new Stronger study, when we reveal the details in full, we can detail how they themselves view how to strengthen the role, but how others themselves also see how this can be achieved. And I think that may be the final slide. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to discussion and questions.
Great, thank you, Danny, and I hope it hasn't been too difficult for you just on verbal. So, and I know that there are already questions coming in. I want to, Rob, I was wondering if you could take the presentation down, and then we'll be able to see Nicola, who is going to be the question master today. But I'm going to take chairman's license because I've lived and breathed some of what you've talked about, Danny, as a nurse director, and I know we've had conversations in the past. But I just wonder, because leadership, and we've got so many people on today, but leadership is at all levels. So how much of your findings do you think are pertinent to all levels of nurse leadership, ward sisters, because those nurses need to be heard, and I think COVID made that very, very clear. So how would you use your research to advise some of those leaders at all levels, be that in independent sector, primary care, acute care?
Yeah, it's a very good point, Denise, and I really appreciate your experience. So, you know, you've been there and done that, and so I really take what you say very seriously. I mean, I think the question of some of the issues that these people, and you will have experienced, have to deal with are very similar to being a leader at, say, ward level or community level. You know, you're always aware of balancing your priorities. You're always aware of building a strong network of allies, whether that's with the medical staff, the AHPs, your management, line management, and certainly with your team on the ground. You know, you're using the same skills that these people are using. I suppose the difference would be perhaps that once you get to a certain level, the scope of the the scope of the agenda, and you would know this more than most, Denise, is larger, so it's more corporate, and it extends beyond, you know, the immediate clinical concerns. But I don't believe you could be an effective ward manager or team manager without having those same skills. It's a kind of natural, I think many nurses have these skills of strong interpersonal skills, strong sense of purpose, and being able to judge, you know, which battles am I going to fight here. I think sometimes people find it very frustrating if they're not having success despite their, you know, their challenges. And I think the relationship between the clinical leaders and the executive leaders have to be really strong. And in the stronger study, the second study, people talked about the importance of being seen, being visible, having a presence, you know, sometimes putting on a uniform and being seen as at one with the issues of the clinical level. So I think medicine has a different kind of history, you know, that they've often been thought of as they're naturally equipped to be the medical directors and the leaders, whereas nursing, I think, has had to prove itself. But having done these two studies, I'm always in awe of how skilled these people are, and especially the ones who last a long time. You know, they really develop a strong presence, strong sense of presence in the clinical setting. People admire them. They go to them for advice. I think those are all relevant. So it's a long way to answer a question, but I hope it illustrates what I see as the link between all levels of leadership.
Thank you for that, Danny. I'm just going to remind the audience, if they have any questions, please put them in the chat, and then I'm going to hand over to Nicola. So Nicola, thank you for being the question master, and if you'd like to take us through some of the questions that are coming through, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Denise, and thank you, Danny. That's just so interesting. Can I just ask my own question as well? It kind of fits on the end of Denise's question to you. And I wanted to know from the Stronger study and from the other study, was there a difference in that leadership role depending on how long they had been in their executive nurse role?
I would say definitely, Nicola. I mean, we had some people who'd been in the role for 15 years, and they had, you know, seen off 2 or 3 chief execs in that time, and they were surviving. They were people who had developed a sense of their own worth, if you like. Some of it had been quite hard won. You know, they had some scars to show for it, but there was also a sense of that the longer they had been in the role, the more they felt that their voice was listened to. And the less worried they might be that they might choose the wrong battle. So, you know, they had strong alliances on the board. They had strong sense of presence in the health board or the trust. They were known to all, and they had developed a sense of, we call it agency, but it's like confidence, really. It didn't mean they were perfect or they didn't make mistakes, and they still struggled with things. But the younger ones, in terms of their experience, were much more alert to the fact that they didn't know it. They didn't know it all. They maybe were more concerned about the decision making, maybe needed their networks more, and had more to learn, I think. So I do think there was a difference between levels of experience in that study, Nicola.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to get on to the questions because we've got lots of interesting questions, and Denise and I can ask you questions all day, which isn't fair. So the first question is from Andrea Bradley, who was our speaker last week, and she asks you, how can we get a stronger nursing voice at all levels when the media and the board doesn't value that role of nurse director?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good, that was kind of the reason behind the stronger study, because we felt from the first study that that was a problem. And the first thing I would say is that I think there are certain images of nursing that are very difficult to shift. And when people get into these more senior roles, they have to develop an executive brain, if you like. They have to think slightly differently. And I think that those who seem to do the job well and thrive and last in it, they're able to counter some of those perhaps more negative or more patronizing views of nursing. But I think this is down to all of us. I think, you know, we all have a responsibility to challenge those perhaps outdated views of nursing. I mean, nursing is changing all the time, and you know, nurses are taking on more and more roles. So I think all of us have a responsibility in our own, whether it's as educators, whether it's as board members, or as managers ourselves. We all have to challenge those outdated. And I think COVID has shown that nursing is flexible, it's creative, it's courageous, and it's got much more to offer, really.
Thank you. Added on to that, and it kind of flows really nicely from that question. How do you feel we can support the nurse directors in this difficult role? I'm thinking here, when we see them as our role models, what can we do to support them?
Well, one of the findings from the first study was that some people in these roles find them quite lonely, because they're kind of caught between, you know, the board world and the clinical world, and they need networks, they need support networks, they need friends, allies, they need to feel valued, I would say. I mean, anyone in a very senior role, it can be a very lonely position at times. So they need to feel, I would say, that people in their organization value them, and also they have a responsibility to develop networks that allow them to feel my staff are behind me, you know, I have their respect, they know some things are difficult to deal with, but at the end of the day, I am here to represent them. And so I think that's it's a very interesting question that I think as professionals, we do need to support people in senior roles. And I think sometimes as nurses, we think, oh, then they'd be too busy. They'd be too busy to hear from me. They'd be too busy to come and visit my area, clinical area. But maybe they would really enjoy that sense of connection that could offer. So I think it's a two-way process. Don't assume that because people have got to these higher positions that everything's okay, because sometimes it isn't.
And interestingly there, the link between the board to the ward kind of work, I'm thinking, and as a nurse leader, we almost have to showcase our areas to those nurse directors so that they know the issues going on. It's about that two-way communication.
Indeed, and sometimes it's not just the nurse director, you know, maybe it's the nurse director and the finance
Yes.
director, so that you know, all of the data has shown that networks, alliances, support from other execs, you know, they can also be useful. Those networks can be useful for your nurse director to understand the particular challenges in each place. And remember, the longer these people are in post, the more they can choose their own teams, as it were. Whereas when they start out, they might have inherited teams that may or may not be working very well. So these are all factors, I think, that show that these roles should not be expected to just flourish without their own support and networks. I know that in Wales, there's a meeting of the nurse directors regularly. In England, of course, it's a much bigger, more regional thing. But overall, I think some people get more out of informal networks than the formal ones. And that's an interesting question. Somebody
Thank
should find
you.
out.
Here's a question then that I don't know if you might know the answer to this. Are nurse director, executive nurse director roles common in other countries?
They're called various things. So they wouldn't be the same as they are in Britain. They may be in some countries like Australia, Canada. But I know in the United States, when we looked at the literature, they used so many different terms that nurse manager, you know, unit manager, that there was so we couldn't work out whether these were comparable roles or not. And of course, in a nationally funded healthcare system like ours, you can compare across 4 countries. But when you look at the other countries, I wouldn't say they were uncommon, but they might have a different range of scope.
Okay, thank you. Here's a really interesting question. Do you think leadership should be further enhancing our pre-registration programs to allow for a change of culture? Should students be offered a short spoke placement with the nurse director teams to provide that strategic view of nursing early on and to inspire our future workforce?
Well, I think it's an interesting approach. My worry about students, I think it could be an elective placement. I don't think it would be a placement I would, given the pressure these people are under, I think they probably wouldn't want constantly to have to look after students. But I think if a student had a particular interest in management, and certainly at post-registration, at master's level, you know, I would always encourage people to ask to go and spend a couple of days shadowing a nurse director. And I'm sure you would learn things that you might not otherwise see. I mean, to go and sit and watch somebody doing a job is a great way to do research as well, you know, doing a sort of ethnographic study, because there isn't very many studies. There's studies of boards and how they work. There aren't really studies of nurse directors. So I think this idea of the undergraduate curriculum, it's already quite full, but I think when people get to the final stage, the kind of management module, that's the time I think they should be hearing from people in leadership positions who could come to them, you know, give them some time, some examples of what they do. Because how many of these people, you know, have always wanted to be a nurse director? I'm not sure. I think some people fall into it or are just promoted through the ranks. But how many young nurses might want to do that if they thought it was a career option? At the moment, I don't think we know the answer to that.
I think I'd like to ask Denise to come in on that. I've got 5 minutes left, but I remembered that we had a nurse who was, I would say, a bit cheeky really, and said, I want your job to our director at the time. So I'm just going to ask one more question, Danny, and then maybe give Denise a little bit of thinking time on that and see what she thinks as a nurse director about shadowing opportunities for students or for postgrad students. So question then, what guidance can be provided to nurses looking to progress in their careers and specifically looking to move from a clinical role to one that's more strategic, a leadership role, and I'm going to throw in there as well a research role in that. So how can they move through their career?
My personal advice would be to have some kind of mentor, you know, whether it's research or leadership or senior management, is to go and ask at your university, your health board, you know, look up your corporate team and see who's there, and just go and have a conversation with people. I know from a research point of view, whenever I get a query from somebody in clinical practice wants to do some research, I'm always very interested to meet them, find out what they do, what the question might be. And I think that might be the same for people in these roles who might find it very refreshing to have a young person, you know, come for a cup of coffee, talk about what they want to do, how they want to do it. And these people have got a wealth of experience behind, of course, to offer young people. I sometimes think we don't push our students enough to think about alternative careers, you know.
Yes. And I'm thinking there about, sorry, the role that you said about the freedom to speak up. That's our first kind of opportunity, isn't it? Just to speak up and within our own profession.
Yeah, and some of those roles in England, of course, are nurses. They can be HR people. They can be any come from any background. But some of them are nurses, and again, they're a very interesting new role.
Okay, thank you. Just one more question then, and then I'm going to go over to Denise for the final words. And how did the nurse directors keep up the fight and the justification of their roles? How did they maintain their motivation, and who looks after them? And I think Denise can answer that as well, because of her role.
Well, from the research, it was kind of from each other, really.
Yeah.
They had strong networks that they developed. They had friendships, people inside and outside of nursing. They also had allies, as I say, on the board. So the people they felt they could trust, rely on, people who understood their agenda. And they might need some support, you know, some of them had coaches, some had undertaken training, they'd undertaken management training, etc. So there were a variety of resources that they used. But it's a people job. It's a job about people. So you do need to have people around you who understand that.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just go back to Denise for 2 little questions and then for us to close. So thank you so much.
No problem.
Hi, Nicola. You're going to put me on the spot now, are you? I think that Danny's research is major because, you know, even though I'm retired now, I was in a nurse director's role for over 14 years, and you do go through your hard times, and you go through times that are fantastic when you see nurses on the front line who day in, day out are giving 150%, and it's quite humbling, really. And I think that much of what Danny talked about, which was about building relationships, was major, and building relationships with your executive team. An organisation can only be successful if everybody is pulling in the same way. And I think the importance of that was extremely important to me when I worked in AB. In terms of shadowing, I understand what Danny is saying about giving people time to get into what nursing is about, but I believe that nurses and students should be learning about leadership from the beginning. And I have shadowed nurses on the ward as a nurse director, because I don't think you should ever forget what it's like to be on the front line. And likewise, I've had very junior people come and spend the day with me, so that they can actually see that it just doesn't stop at the ward. There is people who will be a voice for them, and therefore they're much more likely to come and tell you when things are wrong. I think the biggest thing for me was around always maintaining your integrity and remembering who the most important people were, and that was your patients and your staff. And I think that, you know, nobody can argue with that. That's doing the right thing, and you should always remember that doing the right thing is extremely important, and that you do that within your beliefs and behaviours and the integrity that you have as a registered nurse. I hope that is just emphasise the points that Danny is saying. And Danny, I thought it was fantastic, the questions that were coming through, and I think that these sort of leadership sessions during the lunchtime are just that flavour, and then you can go away and you can read about it, and you can read the research that is there. I've read all of Danny's research, and it's so helpful when you are sitting down and thinking about how can I change the way I work with people, how do I build relationships. So I hope that answered it a bit, Nick.
Yes, that's just brilliant. And I wanted to share as well about the support when you were a nurse director, and I was one of the consultant nurses in an Iron Bevan, and how that high challenge, high support was very valuable as well. And I agree with Danny as well. You have to know nursing, or know what nursing is and how you fit in, so that you can ask those difficult questions and understand. And, you know, it doesn't matter, I suppose, where you are in your nursing career, because we come into it. What I mean is, we come into it at different ages, don't we?
Sure.
So, yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, and I think if Danny had the answers to how to be a fantastic nurse director, I tell you, I would have been knocking at his door a long time ago. So, but I think research is really vital. So I hope that our audience has enjoyed today. I could see many questions. I think, Nicola, you said that if there are questions unanswered, we'll try and answer them and get back to people, because I think that's quite important. Our next leadership session is on the 26th of May. It's from crisis to business as usual, and we've never had more of a crisis than COVID, and really how are we going to get back to normal? You know, there's reviews on its way, etc., etc. So I'm sure that Commodore Alison Hoffman will who's had a huge amount of experience. She's the head of Defence Medical Services Regulator, and I'm sure that that will be a really, really exciting, not that Danny's wasn't. Danny, I loved your presentations today, but this is another one now that I hope many, many people come and join us next Wednesday. Danny, once again, thank you so much for your time and for your knowledge base around that role and the research around nurse directors and leadership. Thank you all very much. And I'll come to the end there, Nicola. Thank you.
Thank you. See you all next week.
See you next week.